No one could understand how a bloke wearing dusty boots and an old farm shirt uncovered the silent mistake destroying millions of Australian families from the inside out. A mistake so common, people thought it was normal. While banks made billions, while credit cards flashed across shopping centres, and while the middle class worked longer hours just to stay afloat, Scott Pape watched it all quietly. And the scariest part? He admitted he almost fell into the exact same trap himself. That freezing Melbourne night, the wind ripped through empty streets while a young couple argued inside a parked car. The smell of cheap servo coffee mixed with stress filled the air. Late bills. A crushing mortgage. 2 jobs. No freedom. And without realising it, they were living the exact life Scott Pape had spent years warning Australians about. But nobody wanted to listen. Until something happened. Because there's a reason Scott Pape became one of Australia's most recognised financial voices, while so many smart people stayed trapped in the same cycle. It wasn't luck. It wasn't inheritance. It wasn't some magical stock market shortcut. It was one brutal decision. A choice almost nobody has the guts to make. And when Scott finally revealed it on national television, some Australians got angry. Others broke down crying. And many realised far too late they'd wasted decades chasing the wrong thing. Before we get into this insane story, comment your city down below and answer this honestly. Do you think an average Aussie can still become wealthy through investing today? And if you're into stories about money, investing and financial freedom, hit subscribe and smash the like button. You're gonna want to hear every second of this. Scott Pape didn't grow up surrounded by luxury. Not even close. He grew up on a simple farm in rural Australia, surrounded by the smell of wet dirt, rusty machinery, and constant financial pressure. There were no fancy cars. No glamorous holidays. His childhood was built around hard work, early mornings, and watching adults struggle financially despite working themselves to exhaustion. While other kids dreamed about becoming celebrities or footy stars, Scott noticed something different. He saw grown men emotionally destroyed by money. He saw marriages collapsing under financial pressure. He saw families working harder every year but somehow falling further behind. And quietly, it started bothering him. Even as a teenager, Scott noticed something strange. The most exhausted people weren't always the poorest. In fact, they were often middle-class families trying desperately to look wealthy. Bigger houses than they could afford. Brand new utes financed for years. Credit cards maxed out. Holidays paid in installments. It was like the whole country was trapped in an invisible race, and everybody was losing. At the time, Scott had no idea those observations would eventually turn him into one of Australia's most influential financial voices. Years passed. Like thousands of young Aussies, Scott tried to find his place in the world. He worked hard, studied finance, entered the investment world. And that's where he finally saw the system up close. The cold office air. The glow of stock market screens. Executives smiling while ordinary people signed themselves into decades of debt they barely understood. And that's when Scott discovered something disturbing. Banks didn't really want people financially free. They wanted lifelong customers. Tired customers. Stressed customers. Customers trapped paying interest forever. The longer someone stayed dependent on debt, the more profitable they became to the system. And Scott realized the Australian middle class was stuck right in the middle of it all. A polished lifestyle on the outside, but financially suffocating underneath. Still, nobody would have believed him back then. Because at that point, Scott also wanted to win the traditional game. He wanted money. He wanted success. He wanted to prove himself. And that's when the first massive shock hit him. The Australian stock market felt like an emotional casino. News headlines controlled investors like puppets. People panic buying shares one day, panic selling the next. Some investors looked rich overnight while others vanished financially. Homes lost. Relationships destroyed. Entire futures wiped out. Scott noticed something most people missed. The loudest investors usually lost. The calm ones quietly built wealth. So he started studying successful long-term investors. The patient ones. The disciplined ones. The ones nobody bragged about online. And they all followed the same pattern. They bought real businesses. Strong companies. Assets producing income. And most importantly, dividend-paying investments. While everyone else chased the next big thing, these investors quietly collected income year after year. No drama. No flashy lifestyle. No desperate need to impress strangers. That discovery changed Scott Pape forever. But there was still one piece missing. Because understanding investing wasn't enough. The real problem destroying Australia's middle class was emotional. Much deeper than money itself. And Scott would discover that the hard way. One morning, Scott received a phone call that shook him. A man had lost everything. His house. His marriage. His savings. Why? Hidden debt. The family looked perfect from the outside. Nice suburb. Good jobs. Smiling social media photos. But behind closed doors, there was panic. Scott listened quietly while the man cried. I just wanted to look successful. That sentence haunted him for weeks, because it perfectly explained what was happening across Australia. People weren't trying to become wealthy. They were trying to look wealthy. And there's a massive difference between those two things. Looking rich is expensive. Becoming wealthy requires patience. While middle-class families burned money trying to maintain appearances, disciplined investors quietly built real assets in the background. That's when Scott began shaping the philosophy that would eventually change millions of lives. Spend less than you earn. Invest consistently. Avoid toxic debt. Buy income-producing assets. Ignore social pressure. Simple ideas. Almost annoyingly simple. But at the time, those ideas offended people. Because entire industries profited from the opposite behavior. Buy more. Borrow more. Show off more. Finance everything. And Scott started speaking publicly against that culture. The backlash came fast. Some people called him extreme. Others said he scared Australians too much. But year after year, his predictions started coming true. Families crushed by impossible mortgages. Workers exhausted despite decent incomes. Young Australians entering adulthood already drowning in debt. And the worst part? Many believed this was normal. Scott realized he needed a bigger platform. So he started writing. At first, almost nobody paid attention. But his style was different. Honest. Straightforward. Human. He didn't sound like a polished corporate financial advisor. He sounded like a real Aussie trying to help ordinary people survive financially. And slowly, people started listening. His success exploded when his financial education message reached mainstream Australian families. Unlike most finance gurus, Scott never promised Lamborghinis or overnight millions. He promised something far more powerful. Peace. Freedom. Control. And that message hit exhausted Australians like a freight train. Stories started pouring in from all over the country. Families escaping debt. Young people investing for the first time. Couples finally having honest conversations about money. Ordinary workers discovering dividend investing and passive income. People realizing wealth wasn't about appearances. It was about freedom. But the bigger Scott became, the more enemies he made. Because he was exposing something dangerous. The financial behavior of the middle class. And whenever someone challenges cultural habits, people get uncomfortable. TV hosts questioned him. Financial institutions hated parts of his message. Experts mock how simple his advice sounded. But Scott kept going. Because deep down, this was personal. He remembered the stress he saw growing up. He remembered adults emotionally breaking under money pressure. He remembered families silently falling apart because of debt. And that's why he spoke with so much intensity. For Scott, this was never just about investing. It was about people's lives. Then came the interview that shocked Australia. Scott openly said much of the Australian middle class was living a sophisticated financial lie. Big houses, new cars, perfect appearances, but emotionally, completely broken. That statement exploded online, because thousands of Australians recognized themselves instantly. And maybe that was the exact moment Scott Pape revealed the mistake destroying the Australian middle class. It wasn't lack of intelligence. It wasn't lack of opportunity. It was sacrificing long-term freedom just to impress other people. That truth hit hard. And honestly, it's still true today. While millions kept chasing temporary status, Scott quietly continued building wealth through long-term investing, dividend income, and brutal financial discipline. But there's something most people still don't understand. Scott Pape's real wealth isn't just measured in dollars. It's measured in freedom. While millions wake up stressed every Monday morning, Scott built a life where his money works for him. And that changes everything. Because financial freedom isn't about luxury. It's about control. Control over your time. Control over stress. Control over your future. But getting there required sacrifices most people never saw. There were years of doubt. Moments where it seemed easier to stay silent. Times when speaking against banks and consumer culture looked insane. Still, Scott kept pushing. And eventually, his message spread across generations. Parents teaching kids how to invest. Young Aussies buying shares early. Families finally discussing money openly. The impact became enormous. Yet even now, many people still ignore the warning. Because modern society is addictive. Everything encourages spending. Everything pushes comparison. Everything makes people feel behind. Another car. Another holiday. Another upgrade. Meanwhile, dividend investing looks boring. Long-term investing feels slow. Financial discipline feels uncool. But Scott discovered something powerful. Boring can make you rich. While crowds panic during stock market crashes, disciplined investors quietly buy assets. While headlines spread fear, dividends continue landing in investor accounts. While people obsess over predicting the market, patient investors steadily build wealth. That mindset separates people who are truly wealthy from people who simply look wealthy. And Scott understood that early. One moment perfectly captures his philosophy. A young bloke once asked him, "Scott, what's the secret to becoming a millionaire?" Scott answered immediately, "Stop trying to look like one." Silence. Because nobody wanted to hear that. But it was true. People buy symbols of wealth long before they build actual wealth. And that behavior destroys decades of financial potential. Australia has seen it happen again and again. Property bubbles. Consumer debt explosions. Families earning good money while living financially trapped. And Scott kept repeating the same warning. The real luxury is not depending desperately on your next paycheck. That message became even more powerful during economic downturns, when seemingly successful families collapsed financially within months. Meanwhile, people holding assets, investments, and cash reserves survived far more comfortably. That's when many Australians finally understood Scott Pape. But there was another side to his message too. Scott knew money alone doesn't fix emotional emptiness. And maybe that's the most human part of his story. Because he never sold financial success as flashy wealth. He talked about sleeping peacefully. Families eating dinner without money stress. People waking up without panic. That was the real dream. And maybe that's why so many Australians connected emotionally with him. Because deep down, most people want the same thing. Security. Freedom. Peace of mind. The problem is most people search for those things in the wrong places. And while the world screamed buy more, Scott quietly said, build more. Build assets. Build income. Build independence. At first it sounded too simple. Now it sounds almost prophetic. But there's one final part of this story most people never talk about. Even after becoming massively successful, Scott never transformed into the stereotypical billionaire obsessed with showing off. He kept speaking simply. Kept teaching basic financial principles. Kept warning ordinary families. Because he never forgot where he came from. He never forgot the smell of the farm. Never forgot the fear he saw in adults growing up. Never forgot families destroyed by silent debt. And maybe that's what makes his story so powerful. Scott Pape didn't just beat the Australian stock market. He beat a mindset. The mindset of appearances. The mindset of comparison. The mindset of financial slavery disguised as success. And honestly, that's far rarer. Today, while millions still chase approval from people who barely care about them, Scott's warning feels more relevant than ever. Invest first. Consume later. Build freedom before building appearances. Because time moves fast. Terrifyingly fast. And eventually, most people realize something too late. True wealth was never the car. Never the designer clothes. Never the giant house bought to impress neighbors. True wealth was always freedom from fear. Scott understood that. And maybe that's why his story hits people so deeply. Because deep down, most of us know when we're living purely to maintain appearances. We feel the invisible pressure. We feel the stress. We feel the trap. And once you see it clearly, you can't unsee it. You start noticing patterns everywhere. People working harder but feeling poorer. families smiling in photos while drowning in debt, consumers financing happiness they can't actually afford, and quiet investors becoming freer every single year. The difference between those two groups isn't luck. It's repeated decisions, daily habits, long-term thinking. Scott spent his life trying to explain that. Some people listened early. Others only understood after losing money. And some may never understand at all. But maybe the most powerful thing Scott Pape ever revealed is this: financial freedom isn't really about becoming rich. It's about reclaiming your life before the system quietly takes it away from you.